I wish to thank the Assistant Secretary-General for Human Rights, Ms. Eels-Brands-Keris. I thank both for the sombre reports that we've just heard. At the same time, I reiterate Ecuador's support for their work. More than a year ago, in the first statement we made as non-permanent members of the Security Council on this issue, my delegation called for incendiary statements to stop. Such statements exacerbate conflict and incite violence. Today, this meeting has been convened in view of the concern prompted over exactly such statements that are today being made in much more difficult circumstances. Mr. President, this Council has been clear in rejecting the forced displacement of the civilian population, including of children, in violation of international law, including of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Council has done so twice in the last 60 days in Resolutions 2712 and 2720. In Resolution 2720, the Council underscored the fact that the Gaza Strip constitutes an integral part of the territory occupied in 1967. It reiterated the desire to see a two-state solution under which the Gaza Strip forms part of the Palestinian government, says the Speaker. Ecuador reiterates the fact that it agrees absolutely with what the Council has said. We also insist upon the need to achieve a peaceful, negotiated, definitive solution, and one which is just to both parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of 1967 borders and on the basis of relevant resolutions. Mr. President, colleagues, in the last days, we have received a report from the Secretary-General on the implementation of Resolution 2712. That report clearly states that the provisions of that resolution are far from being upheld. The report also makes it clear that the progress made falls woefully short of that required. Events on the ground tell of incessant violence, of more people being killed and wounded, and of a humanitarian situation which is unsustainable and which is worsening day by day. Hamas hostages continue to be held hostage. The civilian population remains displaced, and there is an increasing risk of the violence spreading to the wider region. Ultimately, we're seeing how, regrettably, the provisions of this Council have a limited impact on reality. In light of that fact, we believe that it is patently clear that without a humanitarian ceasefire, it is impossible to implement the provisions that have been adopted. However, we cannot lose heart. It is our duty to continue working and to do everything we can to ensure that the situation improves. As such, we welcome the opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing by Israel. That has allowed humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip through a second location. Turning to Resolution 2720, we value the expeditious nature of the Secretary-General's appointment of Sigrid Kaag as Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator. We wish her every success in her work, and we hope to see the timely implementation of the UN mechanism for speeding up the provision of humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza. Moreover, Resolution 2720 calls for the creation of conditions for a cessation of hostilities which is sustainable in nature. We call for progress to be made along that path. To conclude, Mr. President and colleagues, I reiterate the fact that Ecuador condemns the atrocious terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas, which began on the 7th of October. We condemn sexual violence and all acts of violence perpetrated against civilians. I reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Meanwhile, we must guarantee humanitarian access to meet their medical needs, as demanded by Resolutions 2712 and 2720. Thank you. I thank the representative of Ecuador for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Under-Secretary-General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary Brands-Keris for their briefings today. President, I have 3 points to make today. Firstly, the UK firmly rejects any proposal that Palestinians should be resettled outside Gaza, including proposals from members of the Israeli government. Our views and concerns are shared by our allies and partners that Gazans should not be subject to forcible displacement or relocation from Gaza. Second, The UK is alarmed by record levels of extremist settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territories and its devastating impact. According to OCHA, since the 7th of October, at least 198 Palestinian households, including 586 children, have been displaced following an increase in extremist settler violence and access restrictions. We call on the government of Israel not only to condemn settler violence, but also to take direct action against those responsible for it and hold them accountable and ensure that Palestinian civilians are protected. We also continue to call on Israel to cease immediately all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and its lower aqueduct, and to respect their in their absolute entirety all legal obligations. We reiterate our long-standing position that settlements are illegal under international law and that settlement expansions hinder us from creating the conditions for a durable peace in Israel, the West Bank, and across all the occupied Palestinian territories. Third, the UK is intensely focused on ensuring more aid gets into Gaza. The current levels are woefully inadequate for the deepening humanitarian crisis. We're deeply concerned that the World Food Programme is reporting that 9 out of 10 families are going with less than one meal a day. We want to see a ceasefire, but this must be a sustainable ceasefire, one that will last. A sustainable ceasefire means one in which Hamas no longer poses a threat to Israel's security. Aid is delivered without hindrance, and Palestinians can return to the areas of Gaza from which they have been displaced. Ahead of a permanent ceasefire, we want to see immediate and sustained humanitarian pauses. This will allow for hostages to be released and more aid to enter Gaza. In accordance with Security Council Resolution 2720, we call on Israel to allow for higher volumes of humanitarian aid through as many routes as possible. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call again for the release of hostages taken on the 7th of October, for measures to allow humanitarian aid in to meet the desperate humanitarian need in Gaza, for a sustainable ceasefire with a political horizon towards a two-state solution. And we remain committed to working with Israelis, Palestinians, and all parties in the region and beyond to make this a reality. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Algeria for the initiative to hold this meeting, and USG Griffiths and ASG Carries for their briefings. Nearly 100 days into the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, more than 23,000 people in Gaza and over 200 UN personnel and journalists have lost their lives. 90% of the population of Gaza has been displaced. More than 60% of homes have been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are struggling to survive in makeshift tents. All of these are not just the cold numbers, but the loss of human lives, suffering that is experienced on a daily basis. Today, in the 21st century, the records that keep getting broken are none other than those of war and their death tolls. This is a stain on human conscience that can never be scrubbed off. An immediate ceasefire has become the overwhelming call of the international community. but a permanent member of the Security Council has been using various excuses to veto consensus on this issue in the Security Council. This is a blatant contempt of international fairness and justice and the authority of the Security Council. Some people have constantly talked about the protection of human rights and the prevention of genocide. While in the face of the appalling situation in Gaza, they have played dumb, kept stonewalling, and attempted to deflect attention. This is downright double standards. It is imperative that we remove all interference and take robust action to end the fighting, save lives, and restore peace. First, any forced displacement of the Palestinian people must be firmly rejected. Gaza is the homeland of the Palestinian people. Over the past 3 months, over 1 million people have been forced to relocate again and again, but in the face of the constant threat of death, they have nowhere to hide and nowhere to flee. Some Israeli political figures have called for voluntary emigration from Gaza, over which we express our grave concern. That would mean driving 2 million population out of Gaza and turning Gaza into a so-called safe zone devoid of human habitation. If put into practice, such a horrific idea would constitute atrocity crimes under international law and would completely destroy the prospect of the two-state solution. We have taken note of some statements and clarifications made by Israel in this regard. But on this issue, while what is said is important, what is done is even more important. We are paying close attention to Israel's declared intentions, while at the same time paying more attention to its serious consequences in reality. Secondly, all measures must be taken to alleviate the humanitarian disaster. At present, access to humanitarian supplies is extremely limited. Food, medicine, and other essential supplies are extremely scarce. Disease and hunger are spreading in Gaza, and social order is on the verge of collapse. Secretary General Guterres has repeatedly emphasized that conditions for delivering humanitarian aid in Gaza do not exist under gunfire. It is Israel that has continued its indiscriminate bombardment against Gaza and has placed numerous obstacles blocking access to humanitarian supplies. But it is also Israel that has accused the United Nations of not having the will and ability to provide humanitarian assistance. This is totally unacceptable. Security Council resolutions 2712 and 2720 must be fully implemented. Israel must fulfill its obligations as the occupying power, ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, and provide full cooperation in humanitarian relief efforts. China welcomes the concrete proposals by Secretary General Guterres on the implementation of Resolution 2712 and the appointment of Ms. Kag as UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. China supports further action by the Security Council to clear obstacles to the safe, rapid, and unimpeded entry of sufficient humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Thirdly, a ceasefire must be promoted with the utmost urgency. Only a ceasefire can prevent greater civilian casualties and humanitarian disasters and create conditions for the early release of all hostages. Only a ceasefire can prevent the foundation of the two-state solution from being completely destroyed, and only a ceasefire can prevent the entire Middle East region from being devoured by a calamity. However, it is worrying that instead of seeing the prospect of an immediate ceasefire, the situation is heading towards the expansion of the conflict. We urge the international community, especially countries with major influence, to make the realization of a ceasefire the overriding urgent task. We call Israel to reverse course immediately and stop its indiscriminate military attacks on and the destruction of Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel should effectively curb settler violence and stop the searches, arrests, and raids against the Palestinians. Israel should transfer seized tax revenue to the Palestinian National Authority as soon as possible. We are concerned about the spillover effects of the Gaza conflict on the situation in the Red Sea. The military action launched by US and the UK against Yemen will undoubtedly exacerbate regional tensions. We call on all parties to effectively abide by the UN Charter and international law and to make joint efforts to maintain peace and security in the Red Sea and the Middle East. Thank you, President.
Je remercie le représentant de la...
I thank the representative of China for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Brans-Harris for their most pertinent briefings. At the outset, we must stress that the catastrophic situation in Gaza is causing immense levels of deaths, suffering, and displacement amongst the civilian population. Millions of civilians are enduring the deprivation of basic necessities, leading to a staggering loss of life. This plight is no more tragic than when one considers the humanitarian consequences this has on women and children, who suffer disproportionately from food insecurity, malnutrition, and the crippling healthcare system. We reiterate that there is an urgent need to genuinely facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid into and within Gaza, including through the opening of additional crossing points. Furthermore, all arbitrary bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian operations must cease. Equally fundamental is the need to ensure to assure and safeguard the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, including the security of their premises. The rising death toll amongst humanitarian, Palestinian Red Crescent Society and UNRWA staff is unacceptable. Within this context, Malta calls for the immediate and full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720. We look forward to working with the newly appointed Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, towards ensuring this. President, we must also not forget the plight of those hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. In accordance with Resolution 2712, Malta calls for the immediate and safe release of the remaining hostages. We unreservedly condemn the Hamas terror attacks of 7th October, including the recurring rocket fire into Israeli territory, and further denounce any acts of sexual violence committed. Malta emphasizes the utmost importance of adhering to international humanitarian law and accountability for those who violate it. It is imperative that all parties take the necessary measures to safeguard civilians and protect civilian infrastructure. Likewise, attacks on religious sites and individuals seeking refuge within them are unacceptable, as are any deliberate targeting of journalists in the conflict. President, we remain convinced of the need for an urgent cessation of hostilities. The establishment of a humanitarian ceasefire is the only way through which a meaningful and effective humanitarian response throughout the entirety of Gaza can be mounted. This cessation of hostilities is also critical within the context of the displacement of the Palestinian people. Palestinians in Gaza must be allowed to return to their homes or provided with adequate and safe shelter until their homes are rebuilt. The forced displacement of populations and the transfer of populations from occupied territory is a grave violation of international law and a war crime under the 4th Geneva Convention. We reject any attempts regarding the forced or coercive transfer of Palestinian people out of Gaza. Statements to this effect from figures within the Israeli government are deeply regrettable. We are also deeply concerned that in the past weeks we have witnessed a resurgence of forced transfer of Palestinian communities linked to demolitions, illegal settler encroachment and violence in the West Bank. Malta strongly stresses that settlements violate international law, obstruct peace, and threaten the viability of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. Israeli settler violence is unacceptable and must be addressed without impunity. Such action also inflames tensions and risk a further spillover of the conflict. All parties must mitigate any threats which inflame regional tensions, including escalations on the Blue Line and in the Red Sea. The universal norms of international law must be respected on all fronts. A fundamental recommitment to political dialogue, which is based on the realization of a two-state solution, has never been more essential. Malta reiterates its conviction that the only viable path to achieving peace lies within the internationally agreed parameters of the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security. Thank you.
Je remercie la
I thank the representative of Malta for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Griffiths and ASG Brands-Keris for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, 3 months have passed since the heinous acts of terror were committed by Hamas and other militant groups. Since then, Gaza has been under heavy bombardments and relentless shelling, making Gaza as one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes witnessed today. The extent of the suffering in Gaza is unimaginable. At least 23,000 Palestinians have been reportedly killed in Gaza, including a heartbreaking loss of over 10,000 children. Over 85% of the population across the Gaza Strip have been displaced. Critical civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and UN shelters, have not been spared from attacks. Famine is imminent, and those internally displaced are at high risk of communicable diseases due to extremely poor living conditions. Humanity is in crisis. The international community must continue to work with a greater sense of urgency towards alleviating the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. We fully support the recent appointed UN Senior Coordinator, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, and her staff to this end. While the Security Council adopted Resolution 2712 and 2720, regrettably, their effective implementation remains elusive due to the ongoing heavy fighting. As violent regional spillover is already happening, what is most urgent is the de-escalation of the conflict. In this regard, our position is clear as shown in our voting positions in relevant resolutions, including the UNGA resolution adopted on December 12 last year. We would also like to emphasize once again the hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups must be released immediately and unconditionally to create better conditions towards easing tensions. Mr. President, Japan is concerned about the recent inflammatory rhetoric by Israeli ministers on the, quote, resettlement, unquote, of Palestinians outside of the Gaza Strip. Any attempt to forcibly displace the Palestinian people is inconsistent with the relevant Security Council resolutions and in violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We reject any such forced displacement. We also stress the need to create conditions to enable displaced Palestinians in Gaza to return safely to their homes. In this regard, we note recent reports that Israel has agreed to allow the UN to carry out an assessment mission in northern Gaza. We should create a conducive environment where the residents can return safely to their homes. In conclusion, Japan will continue to exert its utmost efforts to contribute to the de-escalation of this conflict within and beyond Gaza. A two-state solution remains the only viable path for both Israel and the future independent Palestinian state, which must include the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to live side by side in mutual peace and security. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Japan for that statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also would like to thank Undersecretary General Griffith and Assistant Secretary Brans-Keris for their very sober and yet very clear briefings. Looking at the situation in Gaza and the broader Middle East region, we believe it is high time to reflect on our responsibility as the Council. Slovenia shares the concerns of briefers regarding the several recent statements by members of the Israeli government proposing mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, and we strongly reject them. Any displacement of the Palestinian population from Gaza would constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian law, amounting to a war crime. We condemn such statements, which are only escalating tensions. Secondly, we are appalled by the current conditions in which internally displaced people of Gaza are living. 85% of Gaza's population is displaced. Military operations, including indiscriminate bombardment, are forcing people to flee over and over again. As the recent report of the Secretary General has outlined, Gaza is facing widespread death and destruction. Famine looms rampant. There is an evolving public health catastrophe, with children, pregnant women, and older among those most at risk. There is a dire need to scale up humanitarian aid and allow rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian assistance. In this regard, we welcome the appointment of Ms. Sigrid Kaag as a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza and stand ready to support her. Throughout the conflict, we have repeatedly called for full respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law. I would like to voice our concern over the grave violations we are witnessing in Gaza. All the reports we are receiving on the humanitarian situation demonstrate that Gaza is uninhabitable. People have been seeking shelter at hospitals and UNRWA facilities, which are overcrowded and without adequate sanitation facilities, and even those have been bombed. Civilians have been sheltering in the so-called safe zones, which have been bombed as well. Mr. President, the bottom line is that no place in Gaza is safe. So where will these people return? We are talking about whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, roads and infrastructure related to water, electricity, sewage. The most basic infrastructure has been damaged. Hospitals, religious sites, schools, museums, the ancient port of Gaza, and more destroyed. Of course, we are aware of Hamas using some civilian infrastructure to continue its attacks on Israel. Of course, we are aware of the brutality of the October 7 attack on Israeli civilians. We are deeply concerned by the information about sexual violence by Hamas, which needs to be investigated and addressed. And we are calling on Hamas to immediately release all hostages so they can return to their families. But that cannot and does not justify destroying disproportionately civilian infrastructure and life in Gaza. Condemning the statements on displacement is not enough. We need to prevent actions leading to displacement. Displacement does not necessarily be a forced one, but could happen because of Palestinians not having anywhere to return. This brings me to my last point, Mr. President. Before we can enable the UN to deliver enough humanitarian assistance to people of Gaza, before we can start creating conditions for a safe return, we need to demand an immediate ceasefire. A ceasefire that would stop destruction of Gaza, that would return the hostages, and that would help us calm the region. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this meeting. Let me also thank USG, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and ASG, Ms. Ilza Brandt-Keris, for their important briefing. Mr. President, when Sierra Leone first addressed this agenda item, the situation in the Middle East, in the Security Council in May 1970, our representative stated that the plight of the Palestinian refugees is great. Development and progress are a matter of urgency for both Arabs and Jews. Surely, it is in the interest of mankind that we should all seek passionately and persistently a way towards peace and allow the process of conciliation and reconciliation. More than half a century later, we are convened in this chamber to address the threat of forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. In the context of the continuing occupation by Israel of the Palestinian territories and the escalation following the 7th October 2023 heinous attacks by Hamas, Sierra Leone has and continues to condemn in the strongest terms the heinous attack against Israeli civilians by Hamas and the taking of hostages. Sierra Leone emphasizes our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, noting that the taking of hostages is a serious breach of international law. We also strongly condemn attacks on civilians, Palestinian civilians, and civilian infrastructure. The practice of collective punishment and forced displacement of Palestinian people. As reported by the Secretary General, 1.9 million Palestinians are internally displaced and are mostly sheltering in or around the vicinity of UNRWA installations in Gaza. We reject any attempt to remove Palestinians from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, either temporarily or for a long time period. We deeply reject the unacceptable high human cost with report of the killings of about 23,000 Palestinian civilians since the 7th October 2023, with women and children being the most affected. We regret the ultimate cost being paid by UN and other humanitarian workers and journalists. Sierra Leone calls for accountability for all those responsible for violations of international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and those crimes of serious concern to the international community. Mr. President, in the past 3 months, we have witnessed a situation that has become increasingly precarious, leading to the breakdown of systems, loss of lives, and destruction of civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. A situation that has deepened the complexity of the Middle East Palestinian question, with ramifications for regional escalation. We note with grave concern the severe humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip due to the continuous violence and denial of access to life-saving humanitarian aid at the scale and means necessary. We call on all parties to comply with this Council's resolutions 2712, 2720, and their obligations under international law to allow for rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to the civilians in need. Sierra Leone therefore calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which in our view will bring an end to the atrocities, reduce regional tensions, and allow for the consolidation of ongoing humanitarian efforts by the United Nations and other international partners geared towards having an effective humanitarian aid operation in the Gaza Strip. In closing, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for political and diplomatic efforts to facilitate the two-state solution that will ensure Israel and Palestine live side by side in long-lasting peace and security. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also join in thanking Under-Secretary General Martin Griffith and Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ilse Kerrith, for their briefing today. More than 3 months have now passed since the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October, which we condemn in the strongest terms. Since then, hostilities have been ongoing in Gaza and Israel, and the consequences are extremely alarming. USG Martin Griffith last week characterized the situation on the ground, that Gaza has become a place of death and despair. Civilians in Gaza, including women and children, have no safe place, as even hospitals are being besieged by military operations and airstrikes. Today, USG Martin Griffith briefed to the members of the Secret Council that there has barely been any improvement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, despite adoption of Resolution 2712 and 2720. In his alarming letter to the Council last week, Secretary General Guterres also detailed that the level of aid to Palestinians in Gaza is completely inadequate for 2 million people as widespread famine looms. Mr. President, more sustainable humanitarian pauses that can lead to a sustainable cessation of hostilities are of utmost importance. Based on these, delivery of critical humanitarian aid must be expanded and expedited. Countless trucks with humanitarian aids from numerous countries are lining up, waiting for their turn to enter Gaza, which myself witnessed in my trip to Rafah crossing. Mr. President, the Palestinian people's right to live on their own land must be guaranteed. Individual or mass forcible transfer of Palestinians outside Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, is simply not acceptable. In this regard, we have deep concerns over Israeli high-level officials' comments suggesting mass displacements or the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians out of Gaza. We are also extremely alarmed by these inflammatory remarks by various Israeli ministers that Israel must resettle the Gaza Strip. Security Council Resolution 2334, adopted in 2016, clearly condemns all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including the transfer of Israeli settlers and the displacement of Palestinian civilians. Any such act is in violation of international humanitarian law and relevant Security Council resolutions. All settlement activities must be ceased, and Gaza must not be resettled. Resolution 2334 also calls upon the parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. The rhetoric of high-level Israeli officials, including multiple ministers, on the possible forced displacement of Palestinians does not in any way help to ease the tension that is widespread all around the Middle East. Mr. President, we all know, and every member in this chamber keep reaffirming, that the only possible way to stop the cycle of violence is through the realization of the state solution, with both Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders consistent with international law and the relevant UN resolutions. Any acts or statements that hinder the realization of this aspiration of the world must stop immediately. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I express my appreciation to Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Elise Brands-Kerris for for their sobering and informative briefing. Mr. President, Guyana is deeply concerned about the forced displacement of the population in Gaza since 7th of October. We take note that many Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced multiple times within the territory. We are now alarmed at the statements emanating from certain officials suggesting that the Palestinian people in Gaza should be forcibly transferred out of the territory to countries in the region and elsewhere. Guyana rejects these proposals and calls on this Council to do all within its power to protect the Palestinian population in Gaza from such a plight reminiscent of 1948. We must condemn in no uncertain terms these and all other suggestions which purport to violate international law, sending a strong message to the authors of these suggestions that they cannot carry out such actions unopposed. Mr. President, the displacement of the population in Gaza is distressing to Guyana on two fronts. First, the circumstances under which people have been uprooted from their homes and livelihoods have created a catastrophic humanitarian situation involving disease, destruction, danger, and death. Palestinian men, women, and children have been herded into smaller and smaller spaces in the Gaza Strip and forced to eke out an existence in the most inhumane conditions and without an adequate supply of food, water, medicine, fuel, and other basic items essential for survival. Social services, including the delivery of quality education and healthcare, have been severely disrupted. Women are unable to give birth, a most sacred experience in a safe environment. There is acute food insecurity, sparking legitimate concerns about mass starvation and death as famine looms. As if these conditions were not bad enough, these displaced persons live with the constant threat of bombs and bullets destroying or maiming them and their loved ones. Mr. President, the second element of concern to Guyana, particularly if there are mass forced transfers outside of Gaza, relates to the implications for the two-state solution. The prospects for a Palestinian state cannot be divorced from the necessity of the Palestinian people inhabiting the territory that pertains to them. Forcibly removing Palestinians from Gaza undermines these prospects, and coupled with an expanding settler policy in the West Bank, leaves no doubt about the likely fate of the two-state solution. In this context, Guyana underscores the importance of advancing the implementation of Security Council Resolutions 242, 338, 3097, and other relevant resolutions for realization of this two-state solution. Mr. President, we must tackle these issues frontally. Guyana was encouraged by the earlier public assurances from the Israeli government that it has no intention of displacing the civilian population of Gaza. But pronouncements by some Israeli officials give reason for real worry. Israel's actions must be in tandem with their earlier assurances. The first and most critical step at this stage, Mr. President, is a cessation of all hostilities, an immediate ceasefire. Outside of this, displacement will continue because people will have to keep moving in the hope of finding safety somewhere in the hell that is Gaza right now. Mr. President, Ghana wants to partner with this Council and the international community to end the indignity that the people of Gaza are enduring. We are prepared to work hard with everyone to end this war and to rebuild and reconstruct lives. Most importantly, we are prepared, as we have always been, to work with everyone to find a path to advance the two-state solution. Palestinians and Israelis alike deserve lasting peace and security. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Guyana for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria for calling this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with particular focus on the forced displacement of the Palestinian people. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris, Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, for their assessment on the situation in Gaza. Mr. President, after 3 months of war, the situation in Gaza is dire, with endless death, forced relocations, unparalleled health catastrophe, famine, and no prospect or hope for Gaza. Forced displacement and limits on humanitarian aid are not acceptable. Innocent civilians are those who suffer the most. It is our duty to uphold respect and dignity. In fact, the United Nations has reported that the Gaza Strip continues to suffer from intense bombardments that have caused immense casualties and destruction of vital civilian infrastructure, creating a total crisis. These actions violate the international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the Geneva Convention on Displaced Persons. The peak of regional escalation of the conflict in the Middle East has reached the highest level. It is therefore imperative that these conflicts cease immediately before the consequences spread any further, or it will be too late to stop and limit its repercussions. As Council members, we have an obligation to ensure moderation and restraint. International conflict laws must take precedence over these actions, and all actors must halt violence and military operations. An immediate ceasefire is our best hope, as it would allow humanitarian access under United Nations Security Council Resolution 2712 and 2720. And most importantly, it would potentially enable negotiation towards peace. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, and I quote, "Resolving forced displacement is not only a moral or humanitarian imperative, but also deals with issues at the heart of the Security Council's mandate to maintain international peace and security." End of quote. Finally, Mr. President, in order to resolve the Gaza crisis, Mozambique called upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint and return to dialogue before the situation deteriorates irreparably. In this vein, Mozambique continues to hold the view of a two-state Palestine and Israel coexisting peacefully in accordance with the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly relevant resolutions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je vous...
President, I thank you for convening this meeting, and I thank you, Martin Griffiths and Ms. Brands-Keris, for your briefings. Your analysis of the situation is unequivocal. The guns must fall silent if we want to stop the conflict from spreading, and if we want to stop the civilian population from suffering, and if we want to facilitate humanitarian access and the release of hostages. This is why Switzerland is calling to take all measures to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access and to establish a sustained humanitarian ceasefire. The unjustifiable acts of terror committed by Hamas on the 7th of October, the number of victims, nearly 1,200. The violence, particularly sexual violence, suffered by many young women and girls, as well as the hostage-taking, were deeply shocking. We have firmly and unequivocally condemned them. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held in Gaza. We continue to attach great importance to the right of each state to ensure its own security and the duty to protect its population and that under its control. Since that day, we have witnessed an alarming increase in the level of violence and suffering in the Middle East. In Gaza, more than 23,400 people have been killed and more than 59,600 injured, according to OCHA. 3 months later, there is no end in sight. It is our responsibility as members of this Council, responsible for ensuring international peace and security, to reverse this trend. The continuation of this violence not only threatens to destabilize the entire region, but also jeopardizes the very foundations of the international system based on law and the fundamental principles of humanity. In 3 months, the Gaza Strip has become uninhabitable, and, in the words of the Secretary General, no one is safe there. As we speak, 85% of the population of Gaza, including many families with children, have been forced to flee. 1.4 million people are now crammed into 155 overcrowded and inadequately equipped UNRWA structures. Therefore, Switzerland rejects and condemns all statements aimed at expelling civilians from the occupied Palestinian territory, including from Gaza. Switzerland recalls that the Geneva Conventions prohibit the forced transfer of populations, which can constitute war crimes. We call on the leaders of all parties to refrain from any unilateral measures, provocative acts, or inflammatory statements, in particular those that may constitute a violation of international law. It is urgent to negotiate a decisive turning point out of this crisis, which threatens the peace and security of Israelis, Palestinians, the entire region, and far beyond. To this end, the full implementation of Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720 is essential. There is an urgent need to increase the flow of international aid into Gaza by ensuring rapid, safe, and unhindered access in accordance with international humanitarian law. The status quo is untenable for civilians. They are under serious threat from the continuing intense hostilities and the shortage of all goods and services essential to their survival, causing famine, which is already affecting 500,000 Gazans. In this regard, Switzerland recalls that the use of starvation as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited by international humanitarian law and may constitute a war crime. In addition, all violations of international law committed in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory must be investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice before the relevant bodies. To this end, the International Criminal Court is currently conducting an investigation into the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, covering both the events of the 7th of October and those currently taking place in Gaza and the West Bank. President, the search for a two-state political solutions, which this Council has advocated for years, is imperative. The conditions must be prepared to rebuild Gaza as an integral part of a future Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace within secure and recognized borders. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for that statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I thank Mr. Griffiths and Ms. Brans-Kerris for their briefings. As has been stated by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, we must strive immediately to bring about a lasting ceasefire with the assistance of all regional and international partners. It is vital to do that. To facilitate the delivery of more humanitarian aid to the civilians in Gaza, we must remove obstacles to to guaranteeing humanitarian access and to allow the full implementation of Resolutions 2712 and 2720. France will continue to provide humanitarian, financial and material aid to benefit the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. We welcome the work of UNRWA and of all humanitarian personnel. France calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This council must condemn the attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October, including sexual violence. France will continue its work to impose sanctions against Hamas at a European level. On a political level, France will continue to call for the two-state solution, with both states having Jerusalem as their capital. That is the only solution which will make it possible to bring about a just and lasting peace. The President of the Republic is continuing his discussions with the stakeholders in the region to achieve that goal. We must work to build a state for the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority has a pivotal role to play in that process in the West Bank and in Gaza, which is destined to become part of that Palestinian state. This council recalled in its resolution 2712 that the forced displacement of civilians was counter to international law. Moreover, France condemns the policy of settlement that is illegal and is a major impediment to the two-state solution. It is vital to put an end to settler violence in the West Bank. Finally, it is of the utmost importance to avoid a regional conflagration. Ensuring stability in Lebanon and the region requires absolute adherence to Resolution 1701 by all parties. France staunchly condemns the Houthi attacks against commercial vessels in the Red Sea. These undermine navigational rights and freedoms. We will continue to shoulder our responsibilities to contribute to maritime security in the region. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, أود بداية أن أعبر.
At the outset, I would like to express our thanks to our fraternal country, Algeria, for calling for this meeting.
To thank the briefers, USG Mr. Griffith and ASG Ms. Karras, for their statements, but more importantly, for the relentless efforts of the United Nations to uphold its mandate in circumstances made deliberately impossible. Allow me also, before delivering my statement, to make two remarks. First, we thank South Africa for its moral leadership with the case it presented before the ICJ yesterday against Israel for genocide. We advise those who were unable until now to even say that Israel has committed grave breaches of international law, let alone hold Israel accountable, to avoid claiming some legal or moral authority to criticize South Africa for seizing the highest judicial body of our international law-based order to address one of the most important situations of our time. The lesson of the Holocaust is not that you should defend Israel when it is committing atrocities, but rather that one should stand against atrocities regardless of who commit them and who endure them. Second, the best way to avoid regional escalation is not the threat or use of more fire, but action for an immediate ceasefire. I have to say, one would have hoped that saving Palestinian children's lives would be met with the same urgency to act and to provide protection granted to shipping lanes. Mr. President, it took 75 years for the United Nations to finally recognize the Nakba. Instead of seeing the Nakba end, our people are yet again confronted with large-scale massacres aimed at forcibly displacing them. This is a Nakba that the world is watching unfold before our eyes. I am from the generation born with the Nakba, with its massacres, its tents and its hardships. I never thought I would see it happen again in my lifetime. 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are already refugees who were denied their right of return for decades now. Many of the people in Gaza have had their homes destroyed in previous assaults. Palestinians in Gaza today mourn their loved ones and mourn their homes that they built and rebuilt for themselves and their families. They mourn their city. They mourn the Gaza Strip as all its landmarks have been destroyed. Every place people had happy memories, it has been disfigured. Now, every corner is filled with agony and death and suffering. In 100 days, virtually every Palestinian in Gaza has been displaced multiple times, from a home to a UN shelter to a tent, searching for safety everywhere, finding safety nowhere, searching for life anywhere, met by death everywhere. Israel has deliberately destroyed everything. It killed and maimed our children, our doctors, our journalists, our engineers, our poets, our academics. It destroyed the very requirement of life and of a life in Gaza. No homes to live in, no schools or universities to study, no hospitals to heal, no mosques or churches to worship, no agricultural land to farm, no bakeries for bread, no drinkable water, no markets to buy from, no safety, no future, and as Mr. Griffith said correctly, no safe place in the Gaza Strip. It was hoping Palestinians would leave under the pressure of its bombardments. They have not. Now it is hoping they will leave because of the destruction the bombs have left behind. Palestinians are traumatized by the Nakba. They have laid even deeper roots in the hope of preventing it from reoccurring. But it is unjust that their lives should be hell on earth just because they refuse to leave their homeland. Our people have a simple dream: to live in freedom and dignity on their land. This is their right, and yet they keep being stripped away from it for decades now. Mr. President, the Secretary General was unequivocal in his report and his statements, together with the entirety of the UN system. Saving civilian lives, allowing humanitarian access and aid, preventing famine, and stopping the spread of infectious diseases, and preventing regional escalation all require an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. You cannot do any of these things without immediate ceasefire. If you want to send humanitarian assistance up to scale, if you want to prevent the forced displacement, if you want an army of humanitarian officers from the United Nations to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance to every corner in the Gaza Strip, you cannot do it without a ceasefire. The SG is correct, Mr. Griffith is correct, and all those who believe in that are correct. And we thank you for the unanimous decision or position of rejecting forced displacement. We acknowledge that. We appreciate that. And we thank you also for the unanimous position of asking for humanitarian aid to be up to scale as the SG requested. And we thank you for that. What you are not unanimously agreeing to is the requirement to do it, the guarantee to do it, which is calling for a ceasefire and for a ceasefire now. And we hope that soon that you will become unanimous in that decision to call for a ceasefire. Instead, mass killings of Palestinians by Israel continue. Death is everywhere. Now it has new shapes, new names, as starvations, dehydration, disease are spreading like wildfire. This is not a consequence of a war, but an Israeli-made humanitarian catastrophe. Israeli confession or denials are irrelevant. Their actions speak louder enough, and action speaks louder than words. Israel wants the Palestinian people to choose between destruction and displacement, between genocide and ethnic cleansing. You need to act now to stop the genocide underway, to save lives, to put an end to this carnage and to restore life in Gaza. And our people will have to figure out how to live with such loss, pain, suffering, and trauma, with how to live without their loved ones, or without limbs, or with visible and invisible scars. Mr. President, there has always been two visions about how to end this conflict. Live and let live, uphold international law, end the occupation, fulfill Palestinian rights, and achieve just and lasting peace based on UN resolutions. That is the international consensus. And another vision, a supremacist, racist, criminal, and delusional vision that somehow this conflict could end by Palestinians accepting that they have only three options: death, exodus, or subjugation. This incessant attacks against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to force them to leave also stem from that same logic, the one that denies Palestinian existence, Palestinian rights, and Palestinian statehood, the one that considers that the solution is not ending the Nakba, but taking it to its term. The international position is clear. There is not a people too many in our region. There is a missing independent state. Act accordingly, protect the Palestinian people, and support the independence of the Palestinian state. Mr. President, the Palestinian people are here to stay. We are as old as our Roman olive trees. They have a right to live in freedom and dignity in their ancestral land. This is the only path towards shared peace and security. All those who want to see shared peace and security should not spread fire. They must support an immediate ceasefire and support it right now. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished council members, this is the second Security Council meeting this week on the situation in Gaza, and the 21st meeting on the subject since October 7th. Over the same period, 3 General Assembly sessions were convened, 2 Security Council resolutions were adopted, as well as 2 General Assembly resolutions. Sadly, not a single one of these resolutions condemned Hamas for their heinous massacre of 1,300 Israelis and for taking 240 hostages. Nearly 100 days have passed. Nearly 100 days of 136 children, women, and elderly being held in dark Hamas terror tunnels. And still, not a single discussion here was dedicated to advance their release. Not even one. 100 days, for heaven's sake. 100 days, and not once has this council convened in order to focus on freeing the hostages. Little baby Kfir Bibas is about to mark his first birthday. A quarter of his life spent as a hostage in the hands of rapists and murderers. And the council has taken no action to secure his release. 100 days. And Hamas has not even permitted the Red Cross to visit the hostages. This is the most heinous war crime. And what has this council done? But colleagues, these are all symptoms of the same cancer that is rotting this institution. For years, the United Nations has been exploited by dictators and human rights abusers. And today, it has become another weapon in the arsenal of terrorists. The UN has lost all moral credibility. 98 days after the most widespread massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, it has become evidently clear that the United Nations can only unite on one thing: the demonization of Israel. 76 years ago, here at the UN, there was a moment of justice and morality when the General Assembly adopted the partition plan, establishing a Jewish state, establishing an Arab state. Israel, as you probably remember, immediately accepted the resolution and established a thriving state, democracy. The Palestinians, on the other hand, rejected the resolution, and from that moment on, for the past 76 years, they have used every means to annihilate us, including the use of the UN as a weapon. They called their failure to commit a genocide against the Jewish people the Nakba. You heard it today. Council members, there is not one single UN body that has remained untainted by politicized anti-Israel bias. Every UN body has become weaponized against Israel by the Palestinians and their automatic anti-Israel majority. Just look at this meeting. The Arab League representative on the Council found it crucial to discuss the forced displacement of Gazans in the same week that Gaza was already discussed here in depth and in the General Assembly. First, let me be very clear. There is no forced displacement. As Israel's Prime Minister said 2 days ago, Israel has no intention of displacing the population in Gaza. Israel is solely fighting Hamas terrorists, whose core strategy is to use Gazan civilians as human shields and who have converted every inch of Gaza to a terror war machine. To ensure that October 7th never happens again, Israel must eliminate Hamas. You all know it. Yet, Hamas has embedded itself in and under civilian infrastructure. There is hardly one home in Gaza that weapons were not found. So, in order to mitigate civilian casualties, Israel requested the temporary evacuation of civilians from active war zones. After all, temporary evacuation is reversible, while the loss of life is not. You know the facts, yet, due to political interests, some of you prefer spreading falsehoods over the truth. Israel be damned. Colleagues, as we speak, there are over 1 million Muslims being forcibly removed from their homes. All of their possessions taken from them as they face poverty, famine, and disease. No, I'm not talking about the situation in Gaza, but about Pakistan's forced displacement of 1.3 million Afghans. Afghan families that lived their entire lives in Pakistan are being forcefully expelled, their lives destroyed and their future lost. 85% of those fleeing are women and children, 85%. This council convened 21 times primarily to assist the people of Gaza at the account of Israel defending itself against Hamas terrorists, but not even once to focus solely on defending the rights of Afghans in Pakistan. Why does the forced displacement of Muslims from a Muslim country mean nothing to the Algerian representative and the council? I'll tell you why. No Jews, no news. But this is merely one example. On Christmas, 200 Nigerian Christians were murdered by Muslims. Over the past decade, 50,000 Christians in Nigeria have been butchered and hacked to death. Is this even a concern to the Council? Again, no Jews, no news. Colleagues, this Council speaks a lot about proportionality. But where is the proportionality when it comes to your obsession against Israel? You dedicate hours talking about Israel and attempting to tie our hands when brutal dictatorships and murderous regimes such as Iran and others are hardly a focus here. Sadly, you are not the captains of this ship. The Council is being led by the poisonous political goals of the biased majority in the UN. Every UN body is now a weapon against Israel, and as a result, those in real need remain helpless. By focusing mainly on Israel, a country that represents 0.1% of the global population, every human rights abuser can continue their crimes unimpeded. Colleagues, in 2023, the General Assembly passed more resolutions against Israel than against Iran, North Korea, and Syria combined. Iran, a country that murders women for not properly wearing their head coverings, guns down peaceful protesters, thousands, and hangs members of the LGBTQ community from cranes while funding terror across the globe, had only one GA resolution passed against it, while its leaders are given the red carpet treatment here at the UN. Syria, a country that has murdered hundreds of thousands of its own citizens with barrel bombs and chemical weapons, also had only one resolution passed against it. Israel had over a dozen, just like every year. It should be crystal clear to every person in this room that the UN is not only broken, it is dangerous. It took UN Women 60 days to release a loose and vague statement on Hamas's sexual violence despite the overwhelming evidence of their crimes. To the UN, Israeli women are not women. Under-Secretary General Griffith libelously said recently that Gaza is the worst humanitarian crisis, the worst he has ever seen. Really? He saw the killing field of Khmer Rouge. He saw 400,000 Yemenis murdered and starved to death. But to him, Gaza is worse. Every single day, Israel facilitates truckloads of food, water, and medical supplies to Gaza and supports every humanitarian initiative, while OCHA refuses to even report about Israeli victims of terror. Where are his concerns, by the way, where are you, of Palestinian leaders, Palestinian officials' incitement to terrorism? They pay the terrorists. They don't only talk about it, they pay them to kill Jews. The PA did not even condemn the October 7th massacre. Where are the concerns? Even the WHO has joined the Palestinians' arsenal. In May, at the WHO annual meeting, a special debate was held to single out Israel, the only country in the world singled out for condemnation with its very own special agenda item was the Jewish state. At that same annual meeting, North Korea was elected to the WHO board, upon which Syria and Yemen also sit. This is how distorted the UN has become. The same goes for UNRWA. Just this week, a Telegram group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers in Gaza was exposed to contain many posts celebrating and praising Hamas's massacre. The rapist murderers were praised as heroes. Their education was glorified, and pictures of dead and captured Israelis were gleefully shared. Countless weapons caches and rockets have been found in UNRWA schools across Gaza, as well as sickening education materials promoting martyrdom and anti-Semitism. This is a UN agency manufacturing generations of hate and violence. It is literally a UN-facilitated weapon against Israel. The list of different UN agencies and bodies that have been weaponized against Israel is endless. But of all the anti-Israel organs at the UN, there is one that puts all others to shame, and this is the Human Rights Council. Currently, important to know the facts, out of the Council's 47 members, only 17 actually uphold human rights in their own countries. And this is the Council we trust to be a lighthouse of morality and good. Not a single Human Rights Council resolution has been focused on the police state of Cuba, not even once, or the authoritarian regime of Venezuela. No Jews, no news. Iran even recently chaired a human rights social forum. To the UN, darkness is light and wrong is right. Israel is the only country that is bashed at every Human Rights Council session due to Special Agenda Item 7, bash the Jews and make news. Like in the General Assembly, Israel has more resolutions passed against it at the Human Rights Council than any other country by a long shot. 1/3 of all commissions of inquiry ever established by the Council have been, guess against who, have been to investigate Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. You're invited to visit, even though you don't want to. Colleagues, just when Israel thought that the UN had hit rock bottom, this organization proved us wrong. South Africa's libelous case at the ICJ is the epitome of the UN's dystopian reality. How can it be that the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, adopted following the genocide of the Jewish people, is now being weaponized against the Jewish state while serving the Hamas terrorists that perpetrated the massacre? Anyone who looks at the facts on the ground can see that South Africa's case is baseless. Hamas is the one that declares publicly and seeks to commit genocide against Israelis, not the other way around. The body that should truly be sitting on trial is the UN. The UN is an accomplice of terrorists. The UN has turned a blind eye to Hamas's digging of terror tunnels for 18 years under schools and Hamas's exploitation of international aid to fund their terror war machine. Mr. President, Israel is fighting the most just war. Israel was attacked unprovoked by Hamas ISIS terrorists whose stated goal is to annihilate us. It is written in their charter, and they have sworn to publicly to repeat the atrocities of October 7th until they achieve this goal. No country, dear colleagues, in the world would accept a ceasefire in a similar situation until such a threat can no longer be actualized. You all know this. So why are you still being steered by politics? Why are you directly following the script of terrorists? Do you not bother to think what will happen if in Israel and Gaza, if there is a ceasefire? We know what will happen. Hamas will continue its reign of terror in Gaza. How can you speak about the two-state solution or any other solution together with a ceasefire that will keep Hamas in power? What kind of future do you think the region will have if this happens? Hamas knows that it cannot defeat Israel on the conventional battlefield. So instead, it uses terror to attempt to drive us away out of fear while weaponizing the UN to help it achieve its goal. The time has come to take back the UN, to force this institution to live up to its founding principles. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. The representative of Algeria has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
De me donner la parole pour...
Thank you for giving me the floor for a second time. Please rest assured I will speak only briefly, but I am going to attempt to help you to conclude this meeting of our council on a positive note. First of all, I wish to thank all my colleagues at the Security Council for their substantive contributions to the matter which convenes us here today. That is the project of forcible displacement of the Palestinian population. In light of our discussions this afternoon, we can conclude that there is consensus within the Security Council behind the need to categorically reject any project aiming directly or indirectly to bring about the forced displacement of the Palestinian people from their lands. This is a rare consensus. It is an invaluable consensus which brings us together and reconciles us with multilateralism. We cannot forge ahead together on the basis of this consensus within this council. But we must do that even if it only deals with one part of the Palestinian issue, because if we do work together on the basis of that consensus, that will reverberate in an extraordinary fashion in terms of public opinion throughout the world, and particularly within our region. So we need to work together on the basis of that consensus. I must confess that in our region, the United Nations and the Security Council need to restore their credibility and rebuild trust in their endeavors. The Algerian delegation is ready and willing to work with all colleagues within the Security Council to make progress in that direction for peace in our region, but also throughout the world. I thank you. I thank the representative of Algeria for that statement. There are no additional speakers on our speakers list. The meeting is adjourned.